Years ago, I toured Thomas Edison's home in Fort Myers, Florida. My wife and I did. We were on our honeymoon, and that means, when I say years ago, that means it was 31 plus years ago that we did that tour. And during that tour, our tour guide said something to us, or told us a story about Edison's 100 plus failed attempts at developing the filament of the light bulb. He said this: when Edison was asked about that after 100 failures, why did you continue? Thomas Edison responded, because I found 100 ways of how not to do it. Now, Edison's point was that he had learned a whole bunch through repeated failures that would help him succeed all the more down the road. As we return to our tour through Luke's Gospels, we find ourselves in the middle of chapter 9, and the text starts in the middle of chapter 9 and runs to the end. But the theme that's tracking through this section of Luke chapter 9 is not a very popular theme, because it's the theme of failure. Specifically, it involves examples of continued failures by Jesus' disciples. Failures even by his closest 3 disciples. Now, nobody likes to fail at anything. Now, some of you might be discouraged by listening to the message right now because I'm talking about failure, and maybe you're thinking, okay, I'm going to turn this off. Might I encourage you to listen to the whole message, because in my opinion, failure breeds wisdom and knowledge, as Thomas Edison's response pointed out. The obvious question for this message, which is titled Stumbling in Good Company, okay? The obvious question for this message is, do you like to fail? Now, the simple answer to that question is, of course not. Nobody likes to fail. Nobody wakes up with the thought, I think I'll shoot for second place today, or I think I'll shoot to lose. We all want to win the race. We all want to succeed. Many times in the scriptures, and over the years I've mentioned that the scriptures tell us, the Bible encourages us as disciples to run the race to win. Paul clearly coached that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. He coached it in other places in Romans. For me, the follow-up question regarding failure is this: how do you respond to failure? Because I think that's really important. Edison responded to failure in a very positive way. He had been tremendously educated by failure, not demoralized, but rather challenged. Now, years ago, almost 20 years ago, I heard a message preached at Delta Lake Family Camp about failing, stumbling as a disciple. That's why I said stumbling in good company, stumbling as a disciple. Specifically, the message was directed at stumbling in the area of, because the message was about exercising spiritual gifts, it was stumbling in the area of exercising one's spiritual gifts. And the encouragement in that message was to keep practicing even if you get it wrong, because it will help you dial in not only the wrong voice that you listen to, but it will help you better dial in the voice of God, thus getting it right as you continue to practice getting it right more often. I came away from that message with this thought: does the fear of failing while using my spiritual gifts paralyze me from stepping up to do ministry by faith? Does the fear of failure paralyze me to do ministry? Now, that is the perspective that I want us to enter this passage that we find ourselves in here, as Luke narrates the examples, a number of examples of failures by these disciples. So here we go. We're in Luke chapter 9, beginning in verse 28. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, he, Jesus, took with him Peter and John and James and went up to the mountain to pray. And as they were praying, the appearance of his face, Jesus' face, was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, two men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure. Spoke of Jesus' departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now, I paused here to connect us with this scene. Moses and Elijah have appeared with the transformed Jesus, and Moses and Elijah are testifying that Jesus is going to depart from the earth in Jerusalem. He's on his way back to Jerusalem, and he's going to depart from there. We do not know exactly all the details that were communicated regarding Jesus' departure and what was discussed, but that's the topic, the general topic that was going on. Back to our scene. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep. They're sleepy in the middle of this scene. They're sleepy. They're drowsy. But when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. And Peter said to Jesus, Master, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah, not knowing what he said. So they haven't heard the whole deal because they've been sleepy and drowsy, but Peter, in normal fashion for Peter to be the first one to speak up, he's like, let's make a tent for each one of these guys. And as he was saying these things, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid. And they entered the cloud, and a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. Moses, Elijah, God gone, and Jesus is alone. And they, the disciples, kept silent and told no one in those days anything about what they had seen. Now, these 3 closest disciples to Jesus were handpicked by Jesus to go to the mountain. In some ways, we could refer to them in today's terms. They were Jesus' best friends. They're the 3 that he's closest to out of the 12 disciples. They were sleepy and dozing off during this amazing scene that's going on. They're sleepy and dozing off during this transfiguration experience that Jesus has invited them to, this event that Jesus is inviting to with Moses and Elijah showing up to as they discuss Jesus' departure, and it's revealed to these disciples. It's as if Luke paints this picture of this event as not being that important to these 3 disciples because they're out of it. It's no big deal. They're sleepy, they're drowsy, and it's kind of like, oh look, there's Moses. Oh look, there's Elijah. Luke appears to indicate that these 3 disciples were clouded in their mind about what had just taken place with them as he describes them being heavy with sleep and not understanding. Luke seems to indicate that the fog of sleepiness may have kept them from fully understanding what took place as they offer to build a tent for each of the 3, Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, in order to worship and celebrate them. Now, this is most likely a reference, the tent is most likely a reference to the Feast of Booths, where the Jewish nation came together in Jerusalem and lived in booths during the celebration in order to remember and celebrate and worship God because he had provided for them while they wandered in the wilderness after the Exodus from Egypt. That's what the Feast of Booths is about, and that's what the disciples are suggesting here. Now, I don't know that this transfiguration scene could be interpreted as a failure by these disciples in this portion of the text, but being sleepy while Moses and Elijah have shown up from heaven and Jesus' face is glowing and he's in dazzling garb and God speaks, okay, I don't know if that's a glowing endorsement that these disciples are handling themselves well in this scene. I don't think it's a glowing endorsement of their performance. I'm not saying it's wrong or a failure, but probably there should have been a different attention by these disciples. Let's go back to our text in verse 37. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met them. And behold, a man from the crowd cried out, "Teacher," talking to Jesus, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child," which is very important because of legacy and inheritance. He's my only child. And behold, the Spirit seizes him, and he suddenly cries out, I don't want to be childless. And he suddenly cries out. It convulses him so that he foams at the mouth and shatters him and will hardly leave him. And then the man says, I begged your disciples to cast this out, but they could not. Now, because this message is about how to respond after failure, I pause at this point to talk about this first failure of the disciples here in the text. Now, if you've been listening to messages from a couple of weeks ago in this series, you remember a few weeks ago, I think it was 3 weeks ago, I pointed out that the disciples' failure to calm the sea while Jesus was sleeping in the boat. If you remember that scene, they woke Jesus up, and Jesus responded. He questioned the disciples in this manner, where is your faith? Now, in that message, I said, in my opinion, that questioning assumed that Jesus expected the disciples would have already understood the power and authority that they had, and by their faith, they could have handled the storm without waking Jesus and asking him to take care of the storm. In our present scene, this man has asked the disciples to heal his son, and they were unable to do so. Now, let's return to Jesus' response to this man, to his request, and the revelation that the disciples were unable to help with this unclean spirit. Verse 41, Jesus answered, listen to Jesus' rebuke here, O faithless and twisted generation. Now he's talking in general, but he's specifically directing this also at the disciples. O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here. And while he was coming, the demon threw him to the ground and convulsed him. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the boy and gave him back to his father. And all were astonished at the majesty of God. But while they were marveling at everything that he was doing, Jesus said to his disciples, let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. This is the second time, at least the three that are disciples heard it. They heard it on the mountain. They heard it from Jesus now. And now the rest of the disciples hear it. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men. I'm headed to Jerusalem for what is my final role here. But they did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them so that they might not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about the saying. Now, a pause here after this first failure for some evaluation of this scene. This is a tremendously harsh rebuke by Jesus. He calls the generation, including these disciples, who couldn't cast it out, so it's mainly focused on them, faithless and twisted. And these disciples are the very ones that he's about ready to turn the kingdom over to as he's on his final trip to Jerusalem. These are the ones who are going to establish the church going forward. And he declares that they are faithless and twisted. Not only are they unable to cast out this unclean spirit, which Jesus appears to think that they should have been able to do by now, they are twisted in their thinking as they are scared to ask him about what he meant regarding being handed over. I think Jesus rebukes them as twisted because they are afraid to ask what he meant because they do not want to be rebuked again for their lack of understanding. Just as they have not understood the power and authority that they already have over unclean spirits. That's the first failure. Let's return to our text for failure number 2 as narrated by Luke, verse 46. An argument arose among them, the 12 disciples, as to which of them was the greatest. But Jesus, knowing the reasoning of their hearts, took a child and put him by his side and said to them, whoever receives this child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. For he who is least among you all is the one who is great. Now, what is the failure here? I believe the failure here is the lack of humility in the hearts of these disciples. They're thinking more highly of themselves than they ought to. This might be a further extension of the twisted declaration that Jesus has made. These disciples, whom Jesus is wanting to be further along in their discipleship, in their faith, are fighting over who outranks who. They're fighting over who's better than who. Actually, they're acting like children. They're fighting over position and status, while Jesus has informed the top 3 disciples twice and the rest once that he is on his final journey back to God, and they're fighting over who's best. And think about, I mentioned the humility part of it. They're thinking more highly of themselves than they ought, not humble. And Jesus will shortly humble himself. Their master will humble himself and submit to God's will to die on the most humiliating and debasing and demeaning of all the Roman capital punishment, death on the cross, while his disciples, who are supposed to be like their teacher, fight over who's greater, over who's the best. It's ironic that they are performing like children in their bickering about who's king of the hill, while Jesus uses a child metaphor. What, if anything, are these disciples getting right? They appear to be a colossal failure at this point in time with Jesus. Let's return to the text for failure number 3, verse 49. John answered, "Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he does not follow us." But Jesus said to him, "Do not stop him, for the one who is not against you is for you." Now, what is the failure here by the disciples? Basically, the disciples were saying, if you are not with us from the beginning, if you are not one of us doing things like we have done, you should be stopped from doing what you're doing, even if it's good. We, the disciple, we have the corner on the Jesus market, not you. Now, I ask this question. Does anyone see the tremendous hypocrisy, the tremendous irony in what John has just said to Jesus? Jesus' disciples think that they have it right, and these others who haven't been with them don't. But these others who don't have it right are able to cast out demons, while Jesus' disciples are unable to do the same. How ironic is this scene? How hypocritical is this scene? This failure by Jesus' disciples is just leaking hypocrisy and irony from every pore of their body. Apparently, Luke does not think 3 examples of the disciples' failures is enough, so he provides us with a 4th. Verse 51. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. Now, just a pause. Jesus will not be deterred from completing God's will for his life. Remember, twice now in the text, he's headed there. The disciples have been told he's headed there. Remember, as the disciples, we as disciples and these disciples are no greater than the master. Jesus will not be deterred from completing God's will for his life, which is the cross, dying for the sins of mankind, the just penalty. And we're no greater than the master. Therefore, we should set our face to run the race that God has marked out for us, just like Jesus. That's why Paul says run the race. Jesus is running the race. We run the race, okay? To be honest with you, failure is not an option. Run the race, okay? As he sent messengers ahead of him who went and entered the village of the Samaritans to make preparations for him, But the people did not receive him because his face was set towards Jerusalem. Now, let me pause again here. Remember, the Samaritans are a Jewish sect, and they felt that proper worship wasn't in Jerusalem, but was on Mount Gershom. They had this rift between the two sects of Jewish folks, and they were bitter enemies. And therefore, because Jesus is headed to Jerusalem, the Samaritans do not want him to stay in Samaria because they think he's loyal to the other sect of Jews in Jerusalem, and they don't want him to stay there because of their hatred, their enemies, even though they're all Jewish. And when his disciples James and John, and by the way, Jesus has nicknamed them the sons of thunder, when they saw it, they said, "Lord," and listen to this request, "Lord, do you want us to tell fire to come down from heaven and consume them? Wipe them from the face of the earth. Do you want us to do that?" But he, Jesus, turned and he rebuked them. And they went on to another village. Now, what is the failure here? Remember, Jesus has already taught these disciples and the large crowd gathered at the Sermon on the Mount. He had taught them this: "You have heard that it is said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven," the name you carry. "For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? You therefore must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." John and James want to call down fire from heaven to wipe out those whom they consider their enemies, while Jesus has already taught them the new way to not only love their enemies, but rather to pray for their enemies, which, by the way, in doing so, has them arriving at a place of being perfect like their heavenly Father is perfect, and demonstrates whose child they are, that they're a child of God, they're a disciple of Christ and a child of God. Overall, these disciples have been with Jesus the most, and their performance as disciples is tremendously lacking, and that is a colossal understatement of where these disciples are at this moment. Luke has reported one failure after another by these disciples. Now, as I mentioned at the outset of this message, none of us likes to fail. None of us plans on failure when we set out to accomplish something. So, question: why do we have this record of repeated failure by these disciples who are closest to Jesus, recorded here in Luke's gospel for us? Why do we have this record? I actually think that it is here for a very positive reason, which for me seems to be oxymoronic, because how can such negative performance by these disciples close to Jesus be positive? They seem to be mutually exclusive or oxymoronic. I mean, if these guys who were closest to Jesus cannot get it right while he is present with them and demonstrated who he was through signs and wonders, how do we get it right? The reason I think this is positive is because Jesus was not done with these disciples yet. In fact, for the rest of this trip to Jerusalem, before Jesus finishes his journey to the cross, through the grave, to the resurrection, to sit down at the right hand of the Father, before Jesus finishes his journey, he has to finish the task of the preparation of these disciples, because he's going to hand off the ministry. To be honest with you, he's going to hand it off to this band of misfits who can't get it right. That certainly encourages me that he is not done with them yet, And here's why. That means that he's not done with me yet. You see, to be honest with you, I'm just like these disciples. I fail to get ministry right often. And failure is okay. And Jesus' rebuke is okay as well, because it helps us learn. It helps us grow. It helps us down the road as disciples. Ministry failure should not paralyze us to inaction. Rather, it should embolden us to keep trying as we figure out what is right to do and what is not right to do. Does the fear of failure keep you from stepping out in ministry? Does the fear of rejection keep you from taking the gospel to those who desperately need it? Does the fear of not doing ministry right keep you from doing ministry at all? Might I encourage you to be bold, more bold with your faith? Might I encourage you to step outside the box and take chances with your faith and see what God might do? Might I encourage you to be a risk taker and see how God leads? Remember, our seventh core value here in the Christian Missionary Alliance is achieving God's purposes means taking faith-filled risks, and this always involves change. Might I coach you along the path to that thought? It's okay to make mistakes because that is how we learn, and learning helps us grow as disciples, so it's okay to take faith-filled risks that may require us to step out and change. The church is in need of disciples who are willing to take chances and speak the truth in love into the lives of one another as we love one another. The world, that's the church. The world is in need of disciples who are speaking truth in love into the lives of people who want to have nothing to do with God, who have never considered Jesus and why he came. The world is in dire need of disciples who are fearless about shining light in darkness. Look at our world today. None of us are perfect. None of us get it all right. But Paul challenged disciples this way in his letter to the Church of Philippi. He says, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection, and may share in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, that by any means possible I may obtain the resurrection of the dead. Not that I've already obtained it or have already become perfect, but I press on to make it my own, because Jesus Christ has made me his own. Brothers, I do not consider that I have made it my own yet, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal of the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Now, I love the language here because it uses the word own. Paul owned the upward call, even if he wasn't getting it right at times. Paul owned the upward call, even as he made mistakes. Paul owned the upward call, even as he did not know what difficulties laid around the corner for him and what decisions he's going to have to make. In fact, God revealed to Paul that his life would be fraught with difficulties, and Paul owned the call, even when promised difficulties, of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Might I encourage you to keep stepping out and to keep pushing back against the darkness, even through failure. Because really, failure is, if learned from, is not failure. It's a learning experience of how not to do it. And Jesus is okay. Jesus is okay with us learning. And yes, there might be a rebuke because we haven't gotten the picture like these disciples quick enough. And the learning curve might be steep, but Jesus is okay. Might I encourage you to chance stepping out even though you might fail as the kingdom needs you. Peace and blessings, Pastor Scott.